In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes, and then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here. Shilajit is one of the world's most popular superfoods. It's loaded with over 40 trace minerals, fulvic and humic acids, antioxidants, and more. It's a resin or tar-like substance that seeps out of the rocks of the Himalayas at extremely high altitudes, formed from centuries worth of decomposing plant matter and microbial activity, distilled by pure rainwater and pressurized by tons of mountainous rock. In a way, you could say it's kind of like the lifeblood of the earth itself, and we can use it to enhance our daily lives by absorbing its power into our body cells. However, if you've tried Shilajit in the past, you know it's true when I say it does not taste good. And that almost seems like an understatement. Some people say it's like licking an old used ashtray, and some people get a little more descriptive than that. Let your imagination run wild. It's pretty bad. But one thing is for certain. I've tried tons of Shilajit products, and no one has ever been able to cover the flavor, let alone make it taste good, until now. My friends at Organifi just released these new Shilajit gummies, and they actually taste good. They deliver 250 milligrams per serving of pure Himalayan Shilajit. Shilajit's benefits include supporting energy production, healthy hormone levels, performance and recovery, promoting collagen synthesis and heart health, increasing cellular energy, and decreasing fatigue. Shilajit has become super trendy in the superfoods and holistic health world for obvious reasons, and people have long been desperate for a solution to the flavor problem. That's why in the few months since Organifi released these, they've already sold out several times. Visit Organifi.com/TWF. That's ORGANIFI.com/TWF, or just head to the show notes. Take a look at their whole collection, and when you go to check out, use promo code TWF. That code is going to give you a 20% discount on all of their products, and they have a lot of amazing products other than their Shilajit gummies. Find out how these superfoods can help you on your health journey today with Organifi. Dean Hall is a licensed therapist and success coach with over 30 years of experience, a best-selling author and highly sought-after speaker, a 2-time cancer survivor, and a 2-time world record-setting extreme distance swimmer. He is the first person in history to swim the entire 187-mile length of Oregon's longest river, the Willamette River, which he did as an active cancer patient in 2014, and Ireland's longest river, the River Shannon, 180 miles in 2017. Dean's unexpected radical remission from his cancers as a result of his immersive adventures in nature inspired him to create his organization, The Wild Cure Way. His mission is to encourage everyone to get out of concrete jungles, man-made boxes, and away from digital devices, and explore and embrace wild waters, deep forests, and open oceans as the most powerful means of authentic, deep healing for mind, body, and spirit. In this episode, we discuss Dean's story of healing, the emotional underpinnings of cancer, processing emotions, mastering your mind, allopathic versus natural approaches to cancer, and the need for all of us to get out in nature to heal. For more on Dean, The Wild Cure Way, and his book, please head to the show notes. And of course, because cancer is typically a controversial topic, I'd like to emphasize that by accessing this content, you acknowledge that it exists to convey information. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any condition, nor is it to be considered medical or legal advice, opinion, or recommendation. By accessing this information, you agree to accept full responsibility for your actions thereafter. Also, we are just a few weeks away from Music and Sky, the Great Outdoors. Don't forget to grab your tickets to join me, Mike Winter, Eileen McCusick, Yerasimos, and Joel from Here for the Truth, and so many other incredible speakers and musical acts, June 20th through the 24th in Mendocino, California. If you're interested in joining us, please head to the show notes for tickets and more info. Thanks again for continuing to tune in and support, you guys. Really appreciate it. This episode was awesome. I really think a lot of my episodes are awesome, virtually all of them. I don't think I've had one episode where I'm like, wow, that really sucked. This episode was great though, especially Dean's story of healing twice from the thing that you can't say can be healed outside of the conventional system. And it's his own life experience, and you'll hear his story during this episode. So enjoy episode 97 with Dean Hall. Dean, thanks for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here, actually.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you here. I reached out to you because I put an ask out on my Instagram after a friend of mine was diagnosed with leukemia. And both he and I are very aware of the difference in approach between the allopathic side of things and then the spectrum of available things on the natural holistic side of things when it comes to cancer. But he was, let's say, he just wanted to see and hear from someone who had themselves reversed any of these issues naturally, right? Mm-hmm. So I put an ask out on my Instagram, and several people sent me your page. So I wanted to check you out, and I was like, okay,
great.
I gotta interview this guy, especially with respect to forest bathing and like cold water immersion therapy. Now there's like a name for it. I bet back when you did it, there wasn't even a name for it.
No, it's called swimming.
Literally just swimming in cold water. Yeah. So your story is incredible, and it just shows the power of our mind, and also just the power of our bodies to heal itself when given the proper environment and proper mindset and just natural things that, nature itself to help us heal. So let's start with your background and your story, and then go from there.
Yeah, my background is born and raised in Oregon. Fortunate enough, I had an idyllic childhood. Things didn't start turning on their head till I hit puberty, which happens to a lot of us. But my parents were both mountain climbers. And even my mom, back in the 60s when all other moms did their best to be the Leave It to Beaver mom, wearing pearls at breakfast and stuff and watching the house, my mom was out there summiting and mixing it up with the guys, even though she hates it when I say that. But she's just this really pretty little Swedish lady. And
is she like the Subaru Outback mom before there was Subaru Outback moms?
Exactly. Before there were Subarus.
Right. right.
Yeah. She even in 54 got in the Oregonian, the biggest paper in Oregon, pretty close to the front page because she summited Hood, and women just didn't do that back then. So it's really cute. But so I tell all my friends I was raised by wolves. I summited Mount Hood, the tallest mountain in Oregon, when I was 10. And it wasn't a big deal. I just didn't want mom to do it, not me.
Right.
But most of the weekends, all the summer, I was way out, days from a trailhead in the Cascades with my parents. And And it was just for me, the most wonderful childhood a guy like me could have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it gave me a deep respect and unknowingly, just this deep understanding and connection with nature. And the reason I say unknowingly is, I mean, do fish know they're in water?
Right.
Yeah. And so it was just the way we lived.
Yeah, and then you moved to Kansas somewhere along that journey.
I did.
And probably didn't spend as much time in nature. I mean, I grew up in Kansas, so like I can say wholeheartedly, especially as my dad now lives in Colorado, the difference in willingness to want to go outside and explore nature. And it's different than going outside to play pickup basketball. I'm talking be in nature is something.
I actually did, Alec. I starved for it so much that my daughter used to make fun of me because I'd pretend the clouds were mountains.
Yeah, in Kansas.
But no, I'd go sit out in the middle of a wheat field, and the little tiny town that I lived in for 30 years is the cross of two rivers. And both of them are terribly polluted and not very, you wouldn't swim in them. But I'd go and sit by them, wouldn't fish in them. And just east of our town, we started having hills. And so about 5 miles east, you could get out in deciduous-like forests. And so I'd go hike out there. It wasn't the same, but it was better than nothing.
There's parts of the Flint Hills in Kansas that are pretty gorgeous.
And that's exactly where I was.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't Oregon, but I was in love, and I promised this girl that I would put myself in exile for love, because she said, I'm close to my family. I'm not moving to Oregon just because you came out here. Mm-hmm. And so you got to make a decision. So I made the decision to live out there and love her. And so I did that to the best of my ability for 30 years.
And then at what point because I know somewhere along the journey, either you were diagnosed with cancer first or she was.
I was diagnosed first about 3 days before Christmas 2006. I was going in for a total knee replacement because what had taken me out to Kansas is I just fell madly in love with soccer. And, I saw a T-shirt not too long ago. An old guy was wearing it. Said, the older you get, the better you were. And, man, I was great. I
could have been a pro. Everyone said, I could have been a pro.
Could have been a pro. Well, actually, I probably could have been. I played for the Junior Timbers and was on the Olympic feeder team. Incredible. And they took us over to play against the Premier League guys several times. And we thought we were such studs. And then we'd get over there in Liverpool and Manchester and Birmingham and play these guys. And we all ended up feeling like Bobo the Dancing Bear. These guys were you playing
against
amazing.
Their adult team or their U21 or U18, U16?
Their feeder teams, their B teams, their reserve teams. Yeah. So most of us were U18 and their development teams are almost all our age.
Right.
But these guys, we knew we were out of our league when we walked into the locker room and there was a Coke can kind of beat up in the corner. And one of them came over, flipped it up with his foot, juggled it for a while, passed it over to the other guy. They juggled this thing like for 15 minutes. And we're like, oh, we can't even do that with the ball, I think. But one of them's like, oh, nah, they did it so easily. We can do it. He couldn't even flip it up.
Right.
So we're like, yeah, well, we just better smile and learn. But anyway, so I played a lot, had a lot of different scholarships, and this tiny little Christian college, it sounded like it'd be really fun to just go. I considered it an extended church camp until I got there. And little did I know I'd find this cute little Kansas farm girl and put myself in exile for love. So, yeah. And so 3 days before Christmas of 2006, I'd been waiting for over 10 years for a total knee replacement. And I'd taught there for 20 years, and then I'd been building my practice for about the last 15. And
therapist.
As a therapist, right. And some of them overlapped. And as a matter of fact, 10 years of that overlapped. And so I mean, in a small town of 12,000, you know everybody, but having taught there, I knew all the kids and the young people that had the lowest level type intern and tech jobs. And so they called me, and the nurse said, "Dean, your blood test came back bad." Well, I'd never really been sick in my life. And my first thought was one of my ex-students had done something stupid and fouled the test. And so I said, "Oh, no, don't get anybody in trouble. I'm okay. I'll come back in." And she said, "What?" I'm like, "It's all right. I'll come back in." And she's like, "Yeah, do." And so I don't know, for a smart guy, sometimes I just don't clue in. But I went and got the blood test. The whole time they're taking it, and they said, "We're really worried about it." And I'm like, "Oh, don't." They never told me they were worried about me. They just told me they were worried about the test. I'm like, "Oh, don't. I'm here. It's all okay. Don't get anybody in trouble." And they'd look at me, and I didn't understand this was about me until one of my best friends, who was the head of surgery there, and it came to visit me at my office one night late. And that wasn't unusual because I'm also a certified clinical hypnotherapist and have been since 2000. And so by then I'd been one for 7 years. And he would come in about once a month. I'd get him down to the theta state, kind of decompress him, help him with his stress. So I thought we were just doing that. And he looked white as a sheet. And when he walked in, I said, "Aaron, what's going on? What can I do for you?" And he's like, "It's not what you can do for me. It's what I got to tell you." Still didn't clue in. And then he sat down in my office and he's like, "Dean, I got bad news." And I still thought it was about him because he'd been having marital trouble. So I thought, uh-oh, what's happened? And he said, "You've got leukemia. Your numbers are racing up by the tens of thousands every day. And it's really scaring us because I've sent it off to KU Med Center and then some folks that are experts in leukemia down in Oklahoma. And none of us have ever seen any. You've got features of both acute and chronic, and never seen anything like it." I said, "Wow." My first thought was, "Oh, at least Aaron's okay." Because I was still in that mindset. Right. I was in denial. And then I realized, whoa. I said, "Well, what does that mean?" He's like, "You're in trouble." I said, "Well, what does that mean? I know they don't tell you how long you have anymore." And he's like, "Weeks at most.
Wow.
If this doesn't change to one or the other." So he says, "You want to just hope and pray it changes to one, and hopefully it'll be chronic rather than acute." And so for about 2.5 weeks, it was touch and go and real scary. But then about week 3, it just settled down into chronic. And my numbers were so high, I was really sick for about a year. And then I just started getting better. And we thought that I'd weathered the storm. I'd learned a lot of lessons. I'm so ADHD that if they would have had that when I was a kid, I probably would have been heavily medicated. But I never really slept. 4-6 hours, I'm good. Probably better at 4.
That's how you are typically?
Oh, yeah. I was. And so I started forcing myself to sleep 8 to 9 hours a night. I cleaned up my diet. I let go of most sugars, caffeines. I was married to a Baptist, an Oklahoma Baptist. And so I hadn't had a drink since 1979, so I didn't have to worry about that. And then just started doing everything we could to get my body in a place. And having been clinical hypnotherapist, I'd been meditating for an hour a day since October of 2000, and this was 2006 end of. And so I decided to up that to more than that. And so I started meditating 3 times a day and doing visualization. I've always called it praying in pictures, because for me, it's not only mental and physical, psychological, it's spiritual.
100%.
Yeah. And
I love that. I might steal that from you. That's praying in pictures. Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah. I You're the first person I've ever told that.
Well, because it implies that there is more than just you doing something. It's you sending a prayer to the divine,
Right.
for the divine to help bring into being that which you are focusing on.
Exactly.
I like that way better than just visualization.
Great, Alec. You already took the thing I say and made it way better. So bravo. But yeah, no, I've always thought of it as such. And to the point that in my own faith practice, I never use words, never use words unless I'm in public. And I tell everybody my spiritual life's kind of like my sex life. It's really important, very enjoyable, but I don't talk about it to you.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. So, started doing that, found a lady that, does fantastic guided imagery. Her name's Kelly Howell. She's kind of new agey, but she had jumped into a field called neuroacoustics. It's the therapeutic use of sound, and does some really wonderful stuff that you have to wear stereo headphones for. And so I started listening to her 3 times a day too. And she has something, it's on YouTube for free, 30 minutes long, simply entitled Heal, where you imagine and visualize yourself healing. The other thing that I just absolutely positively put my faith in, actually you could say I bet my life on it, was that I heard the research came out early 2000s that we have an entirely new body every 13 to 18 months. Every cell in our body sloughs off and is regenerated. And so I thought, man, if I can just do the right kinds of things and super fuel my mind, body, and spirit and hold on, within about 18 months, I should be okay. And both times it was right in that 13 to 18 month mark that all of a sudden the doctor's scratching their head and saying, boy, Dean, how do you feel? I feel great. We can't understand, but your cancer is gone.
And this is in the first one with leukemia.
The first one, no. The first one, the numbers just came radically screaming down.
Got it. Would they have considered that remission at that
With
point?
With chronic lymphocytic leukemia, here's the rub. In allopathic medicine, the lore is that it never goes away, that you just have to manage it. And to this day, during COVID, I thought I should go in and get a physical. And so I met my new doctor remotely. I made the mistake of telling him that I'm a cancer survivor. He asked me what. I told him chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and he says, oh, so you still have it? I said, no, I don't. He said, yes, you do. I said, no, I don't. He said, yes, you do. I said, you've never met me. You haven't done any blood tests. You haven't looked. Have you looked at my numbers? No. I said, well, those come from the world's number 3 researcher in chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And if he hadn't retired, he would tell you that you're wrong. It's gone. As a matter of fact, he scratched his head and said, you know, Dean, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've written most papers on chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and I've never seen this happen. He said, if I hadn't diagnosed you myself, I would have thought you'd been misdiagnosed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. My wife experienced the exact same thing, and I got to witness it myself.
Really?
With not with cancer, but with, quote, autoimmune diseases. She had lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, and she was told she would always have it, even when she was feeling better. And she's not had it at all in the last 8 years. So,
yeah, I tell everybody that what the body creates, the body can heal. And if you think that's not so, then I believe you're misinformed. Now, that's a pretty bold thing for a guy like me who has no medical training to say, but I think I've got the life experience to prove it.
Right. And we're going to get into all of that. Yeah. Okay. This is already incredible. I want to ask though, with your first cancer diagnosis, how much do you think the diagnosis itself, having the words, you are positive for X, Y, and Z type of cancer, How much do you think that played into some sort of psychosomatic creation of the corresponding symptoms that ensued afterwards?
Looking back, I think it had a ton to do with it because I really respected the man that told me. We had become close friends. He's just absolutely brilliant. He's been on the KU Board of Medicine for years. And if anybody had told me, I might have questioned them. But since Aaron told me, we'd watched each other's back and been through so many experiences where with car trauma and other patients where we're kind of tag teaming them. So we'd gotten really close. And I remember he said to Mary, he'd ask Mary how I was doing. And she's like, he is really, talking about me, Dean is really sick. And he said,
how did you feel though prior to that?
Tired.
Just tired. Yeah,
tired.
Prior to the diagnosis.
But I was working 60, 80 hours a week.
Right, yeah.
And being my own private practitioner, it wasn't unusual for 2 or 3 people to go suicidal in a week. And then I'm, maybe staying up for 24 or 36 hours trying to juggle these folks, keep them alive.
And you're dealing with a lot of other people's traumas too.
Yeah. By the time I was diagnosed, I had been for almost 10 years, but certainly the last 6, specializing in not only anxiety, but sexual trauma. And so people from 60, 80, I even had people that had heard about me. And this is not bragging because that's not my style. It's just the way it is. The old baseball player Dizzy Dean said, it ain't bragging if you done it.
Yeah, right.
But people drive, of course, you'd have to know Kansas too.
Right.
You drive a long ways because everything's so remote. So it wasn't unusual for people to drive a couple hours to see me. And because of the work I was doing with hypnotherapy, but that work is hearing the story and helping them reframe it and look at it more objectively. It's part of what's called narrative therapy. The story you tell yourself has so much to do with the outcomes. And so hearing these stories of rape and molestation and incest 40 or more times a week, I thought I was meditating enough and sloughing it off. But I just was incurring more secondhand trauma than I even realized.
Yeah.
So I think that had an awful lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that your inkling to approach this from what could be considered a holistic lens from the get-go is a result of you having been a therapist? And the second part to that question is, were you already recognizing that physical symptoms had a emotional psychosomatic underpinning to them?
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many of my clients would come in with chronic anxiety or depression, and we'd work through it using hypnotherapy and other alpha and theta state techniques. And miraculously, in a week or two, those not only would the anxiety and depression abate, or at least be ameliorated to a great degree, but then the physical symptoms were too. And I've seen some of your books. I was doing a lot of reading of Bruce Lipton and others that were big in the field. And so, yeah, it really had a lot to do with the way I was thinking. I knew there was a huge mind-body connection. And the other thing that helped me as a therapist is so many of the families had somebody, or they themselves had a problem with cancer. And so I'd watched many folks, many that I really cared about, struggle and tell me the intimate details of what was happening, what it was like, to find out what the doctors said, what the doctors made them do, and how forceful they were in requiring that the patients do what they said. And then also, my dad had had prostate cancer. And then 10 years before I was diagnosed, he'd been diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, even though they say it's not genetic at all. Yeah.
Wow. So that was your first cancer story. And let's wrap that one up real quick.
Sure.
Did you do any conventional approaches at that time?
Yes. I went to, well, yes and no. I went to the oncologist, this wonderful man from Uganda. His name was Dr. Anatoly Ugundape.
What a name.
Isn't that great?
That's a great
It took
name.
me about half of my cancer recovery just to learn how to say it. And before my wife died, I hope this is not a spoiler, but before my wife died, I never cried. And one time I was really sick and kind of worried that, maybe I should be following his advice more. But I turned around and this man was like 6'3", 6'4", just this big, strong man from Uganda. And he looked at, just as I was walking out and kind of my head was hanging down, I looked up at him and our eyes met and he says, "Be well, my friend." And I never had a doctor act like that.
Yeah.
And tears.
Wow.
But he was just a wonderful man. And he was, he worked with me. He listened to me. The first thing he suggested I do was chemo and radiation. And I said, that's kind of, in my and uneducated view, that's kind of dropping an atomic bomb at the start of a battle.
Right.
I said, I want to save that when I don't have any other conventional weapons. I want to drop the big bomb if nothing else has worked. And he said, "I've never heard it said that way, Dean." That's my best Ugandan.
Yeah, that was
accent.
good.
And, but he complied. He didn't give me any problems with that. He said, if that's your choice, I respect it. And he said, but let's watch these numbers. If it gets this high to a critical level, we're going to have to drop the bomb. And I said, okay, I'll do that. But thankfully, it never got to that level. And so I had some real scares. I almost died from pneumonia summer of 2007 because my immune system was so suppressed. I did a lot of laying on the couch, and I knew I was in trouble when I binge watched for the first time in my life American's Next Top Model. My daughter came in, she's like, "Dad, you are sick."
You've hit a low point.
Yeah. What happened to my dad? Because this is a sick version.
Right.
And so, I was acting very uncharacteristic and just in this real funk for the first time in my life. Yeah. But then I got better, and amazingly so. And I thought, well, every hardship in life has its lesson. Right. I learned several lessons from that, and will never go back to not sleeping, thinking I'm Superman, and thinking that I can eat all sorts of toxic goo and get away with it, and I'm good.
Yeah. At this point, with your first one, did you? Obviously, you had made a link between some emotional trauma and physical manifestation of symptoms, obviously. But did you have that feeling, that this was a piece of what was happening with you, especially because you shared here that previous to this, you had never cried? Was that because you had never really experienced traumatic situations yourself, or do you think at some level you were suppressing some of your
If you would have
trauma?
talked to the dean then, he would have said he'd been through a lot of stuff. After what I've been through, it was child's play. My wife and I suffered from infertility for about 10 years. That was heartbreaking because we were both teachers. We both loved kids. I married her because I knew she'd be the best mom ever. She was a kindergarten teacher, for God's sake. And to watch her suffer, her mom had taken a fertility drug back in the 50s called DES, and it rendered most of the female progeny infertile.
Wow.
And they always said that most of the women, and this was in the 90s then, were dying from some form of cancer, or they were infertile. And so I'd always hug my wife and kind of chuckle and say, well, this is better of the two options, not knowing that it was an either or, but a both and. And this wonderful doctor, Dr. Aaron Waters, that I was telling you about, he says he thinks that's eventually what got her.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So fast forward then. So you did recognize at that point that there was some emotional things that you were going through that you might have suppressed to some degree.
And mostly the secondhand trauma plus
from being a therapist, the secondhand trauma.
Yeah. And well, I followed the EMTs out for 2 years because they had found that I'm good at handling folks in crisis. And so I'd terrible car wrecks or farm accidents. I'd go out, kind of handle everybody while they did the triage.
Yeah.
And then I had to beg off of that because I was just having nightmares every night and reliving it myself. But no, my life was pretty good, other than there wasn't a day that went by. And I never talked about it because I'd promised this sweet little Kansas girl that I was going to live. And so it was my decision, but there wasn't a day I didn't have acute feelings of loneliness for Oregon and for the geography, being out in the forests and up in the mountains and in that clear, beautiful water. There wasn't a day I didn't feel it. I think I only talked in 30 years. I only mentioned it 2 or 3 times.
Wow.
And so carrying that heavy loneliness all the
like
time.
Like a longing to be,
Yeah, heavy longing would be a better way of saying it.
Yeah. So, and then when you went this, let's say non-conventional route, because you didn't end up doing any of the chemo or radiation for the leukemia at first, what do you, this is a pretty broad question, but what do you think is what put you over the edge to resolve cancer? And let me preface this by saying, I've come to understand the allopathic system's idea of what cancer is completely off base. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. And maybe we could get into this. This is kind of me just rambling here, but that cancer is, on one hand, we have what German New Medicine would say, that it is an adaptation of the body to a conflict, right? And it is quite literally the healing phase. And then on the flip side of that, the likes of Dr. Cowan, whom I respect greatly, and I've consider a mentor of mine, would say that cancer is still the healing phase, but it's like the body packaging up toxins and sort of putting it in one place to make sure that it doesn't leach into the body, and it's helping to sort of resolve the toxicity of the body. But what do you think? Yeah, actually, let's start there. What are your thoughts on that with respect to cancer?
I think so much, and the more I learn and the more I live, the more I believe there's a huge mind-body-spirit connection. You cannot separate it, and I think we're egotistical and errant to think we can. I think 10 to 20 years, definitely 50, we will look back at the last 50 years as the dark ages. Where we just discounted so much of our birthright and power to recalibrate. Yeah. And there's something that I was trained in as part of my hypnotherapy certification and my reading and extra trainings in mind-body medicine and approach called mind-body conversations. And the first time, there in late 2006, it was probably early 2007, I finally came down out of the shock and horror and terror of the diagnosis. And I remembered, oh my gosh, the best thing I could do is get in a nice state of meditation and ask my body why the leukemia is there. And so I did so. And very quickly I got the answer: you hold on to fear and you nurse your anger. And I thought back on my life and I'm like, I've never been scared. Oh, geez. That's usually why I'm angry, is because it's really macho and tough to act angry, to cover all that fear. And I started noticing after the weeks after, anytime I was scared, I was pissed. and how I covered that fear with anger, and how kind of gave a fertile breeding ground to both of those. And so I made it a very prayerful daily exercise to notice anytime I was above a 4 or 5 on a scale of 0 to 10 on either one of those, and as quickly as possible resolve it and do what I call zero out, go back down to 0. And I became fairly adept at it. And the better I got at it, it's a lag. I'd say 3 to 6 months, but within 3 to 6 months, I started noticing greater and greater strength in my body as well.
What a gift, though. What a gift to have your body tell you that hey, it's these feelings of fear that you're suppressing or covering up with another set of feelings that are just breeding toxicity in your body.
Right.
And
but you have to understand, back in 2007 in small town Kansas, I never told anybody that.
Yeah, no way.
It was just something I had learned, and it worked for me.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something I was loud or proud about.
Right.
It was something, even to this day, if you say that in most circles, they'll think you're some kind of wackadoo.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. But you experience it, and this is your life experience, and you found it to be true, which is incredible.
Absolutely true. As a matter of fact, for me, fundamentally true. It's a foundation of how I live and breathe now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to get to the second diagnosis of cancer, and of course your late wife's story too.
Sure.
But the last thing that I want to ask with respect to this, and I kind of touched on it a minute ago before I went off on a huge rambling, so sorry about that.
No, I love it.
What were the key figures or the key things that you think helped to resolve this and come back to a state of, at that time, optimal health after, the initial diagnosis, the meditation, the acknowledging of the emotions, the cleaning up diet, kind of just like a really big holistic framework?
Yeah. That and the power of purpose. I'd been working in sexual trauma for years and years, and my wife and I had, even before I was diagnosed, seen the effects of it, because she saw me, she felt me kicking a lot of nights from nightmares. And I'd never been sexually abused that I can remember. I think I would. And, I was having these victim dreams where I all of a sudden had become the victim of the story, and I was re-experiencing, which is very typical with trauma and secondhand trauma. If you have enough of it, you start taking on the role of the victim.
Are you familiar with the human biofield?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. It makes total sense that when you're overlapping.
I wasn't aware then.
Right.
Yeah.
But it makes total sense from that lens when you're overlapping with someone else's field consistently who is experiencing trauma, that if you are not aware of that energetic piece of it, that's going to rub off on you a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. Especially because we're sitting this closely or even closer. And I was getting them down into theta state. Theta is the point at which the 10% of the conscious mind fully interfaces with the 90% of the subconscious. So we're in a very unconscious state. I take myself down almost there. Most of it, and I would promise the ladies this, I'm not just going to be sitting there looking at you. I'm going to close my eyes too so that I can really join with you. I would use that phrase.
Right there. Right.
And I noticed, Alec, that when I did that, I would feel their feelings, even see their sights. As much as I can ascertain that I was actually watching what they were watching or experiencing. And the weird thing is, time and time again, I would know where they were going. I would see it and feel it before they'd say it out loud.
Wow.
And so that's what really convinced me of bioenergetic field.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move now to your wife's story. So then,
healthiest person I've ever known. Most of the people in her family, her dad's side, came over from Germany. He had his little German Baptist Bible. He didn't speak English till he was 5 and was forced to go to school. his family and the community that came with that, they all moved over together and brought the Russian red wheat that's so popular and really made Oklahoma what it is in the wheat industry. And very, 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 very Baptist. She told me when she knew we were going to get married that I couldn't drink. And I said, really? What? Why? And she said, because you're going to be married to me and I don't want my husband to drink. So you're going to have to make a decision. I was like, okay. And my parents hadn't been drinkers, so it wasn't that big a deal to me.
Yeah.
But when she died, Alec, we realized she'd never tasted any form of alcohol, never even had a sip of beer, never smoked a cigarette in her life, never taken any kind of drugs, always eaten well, and always worked out, was in great shape. Picture of health, you would have never known.
Wow.
And then all of a sudden in 2010, she started forgetting things, but not much. And it's not unusual right around harvest for so much wheat dust in the air for people to get pneumonia. And they thought she had pneumonia because she was real tired, and she was so energetic and was such an Energizer bunny that her cousin used to laugh and say that Mary could solve world peace before she could get her shoes on. I mean, she was she only had two speeds, extremely fast and asleep. There was no in between. And so when all of a sudden she started laying on the couch a lot, it made me concerned. But everybody, all the doctors thought, well, it's just this pneumonia. But she never got better. And then she started getting a little forgetful. And I'd had several clients who'd had brain tumored folks in their family, and they dealt with that. And, dizzy spells, memory loss, and then also blinding headaches. Well, she had a bit of memory loss, but she didn't have any problems with dizziness or nausea or headaches at all. And then I'm trying to take care of her because she's really sick, and I'm working like crazy. And she had been my receptionist for years. And so all of a sudden I'm doing the books, I'm calling people, I'm running home, trying to make her some soup, make sure she's okay for the next few hours, then running back. And I bought a sandwich at a fast food place, and it was in a plastic box. And this is August, so it's 107, 110 outside. I left it in the car for a day. I'm a guy, right? And I realized, oh my gosh, I got Mary taken care of, but I got to go back. This was about 5 o'clock till about 10 o'clock. And I'm driving back to my office and I see that sandwich. I'm like, oh, great. Ate it. And halfway through the session, I started getting chills. And I'm like, it's 110. I couldn't be getting hypothermia. What's going on? And I kept getting sicker. And finally, I had to cancel the rest of the night. Went home. I was sick as I've ever been. And I'd always been, except for the leukemia, really healthy. So I'd never taken Advil or Tylenol practically in my life. And I looked to see what we had. And we had a bottle of Advil because my temperature was going really high. It was just screaming up. And then I'd sweat profusely. And then I'd get the chills. And we'd do this whole thing over and over again. And so I sent Mary and my daughter to go stay with her family because I was sick. I couldn't take care of anybody. And so for the next 6 days, I would throw up, have these hot sweats, have these cold times, and just wait for 4 hours till I could take some more Advil.
Wow.
And then after 6 days, I started throwing up this K-Rose syrup looking stuff. I'm like, this isn't right. So I drove myself to the emergency room, and the resident there just started acting weird. So I called up Aaron, and I'm like, Aaron, I'm leaving. I said, this guy's acting goofy. He's running in and out. He's acting like this is life or death. And Aaron's like, well, you're in total renal failure.
Oh, wow.
So it kind of is, Dean. Please stay. And he said, I think you're going to be fine, but don't go anywhere. He's like, you drove yourself there? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, okay, stay. And so I did. And so I was in the hospital the next 8 days, and they sent me up to Wichita and had just this brilliant doctor there finally come. He was so smart. He was a Czech, and he was so brilliant. I can't do a Czech accent, sorry. But he would not even carry a clipboard around. He'd look once or twice at all of his patients' statistics and vitals, and he'd have them memorized and tell them to you. And he said, I've looked through everything. He said, you've got no reason to have been this sick. What do you think started it? I said, well, I think I had food poisoning. He said, did you take Tylenol or Advil? And I said, oh, yeah, I took Advil every 4 hours for the last 6 days. And he said, and you probably weren't drinking anything. I said, no, I was throwing up. He said, that's what did it. He said, thank God you didn't take Tylenol. It would have ruined your liver.
Wow.
This just, upset your kidneys.
And what year was this?
This was 2010.
Wow. Okay. So there was some information already starting to come out around then about the toxicity of Tylenol and Advil, but this was a perfect example of it.
Didn't know.
Yeah.
And so during this 8 days, I'm in ICU and being transferred and just sicker than a dog. Mary her health just went downhill.
Wow.
And her whole right side of her face fell. And so at first they thought she had Meniere's. And I'm hearing this, but I'm so sick, none of it's really hitting me. And then her friend calls and says, I'm going to bring Mary up. And I said, what do you mean? Because I'm 60 miles north of where we lived. And I said, what do you mean you're going to bring Mary up? And she's like, she can't drive.
Wow.
And I said, oh, she's been sick. And she's like, no, she can't feel her right side. I'm like, what? And so she came up and this side of her face, she was a pretty woman. And this side of her face was just distorted and falling. And she's trying to talk out of this side of her mouth. And you could tell her arm was kind of useless and not functioning. And so I thought, wow. But I still am so sick. It's not really registering what's happening. And so I get home and I call Aaron again. He was with us through this whole thing. And I said, you know about Mary, right? And he's like, yeah. I think we need to get her up and get an MRI right away in Wichita. So I had this same friend drive us up the next day. We got an MRI. And the tech acted really weird. And, I've been a people watcher forever. And I thought, man, something's awry. And so as soon as we got out of there, Aaron called me and he said, hey, when are you going to be home? And I said, in an hour. He's like, well, when you get home, let me come over. I said, oh, this is bad news. You're going to make me wait an hour? He said, well, no, I won't. She's got the largest tumor I've ever seen. Tumors are operable and they can do something with them in proportion to how high in the brain they are and how far forward. Yeah. And he's like, hers is deep back, all knotted around the brain stem. He's like, it's huge. He's like, I've called in some favors, got you up to one of the best neurosurgeons in the world up at KU Med Center. He said, we're going to get her up there in 2 days. So we did. And again, I'm still so sick. It's not really registering what's going on. And we get up there. I'd called my parents and they were here by then and they went up with us, thankfully. And by then she's not walking. I'm wheeling her in a wheelchair. And he took a look at the film for 30 seconds. He's like, can we get married to leave? And so I wheeled her back out and he's like, we could do laser guided surgery and there's an 80% that we'd nick a vessel and she'd be a quadriplegic or a nerve, or nick a blood vessel and she'd bleed out on the table. About 80% for that too. He said, and even if it went perfectly, we'd only be able to get about 50% of the tumor. And then she'd have to go down to MD Anderson and have a lot of chemo and radiation. I said, well, what would the prognosis be then? He said, give her another 6 to 8 months. I said, what would that 6 to 8 months be like? And he said, it would be like having a migraine and the flu at the same time. And I said, well, what would happen if we don't do anything? He said, she probably won't have a lot of pain. She'll probably continue to lose all her faculties, sleep a lot more, and within the next 6 months, just slip off in her sleep. I said, well, that's what we do then. And so that's what we did. Only from that day on, it was only 52 days. And to me, that was merciful to the both of us because it was just so hard to watch. Yeah.
Especially the woman you loved and you committed your life to.
Right.
Yeah. So if I may ask, what in hindsight do you think, and I'm sure you've thought about this quite a bit, was ultimately the cause of her cancer, if you had to question it?
Well, there are so many things in this tiny little town. Conoco had been there, I believe.
Farming community too?
Yeah, it was a farming community, heavy pesticides. Most of the people our age that had been born or raised in the 50s and 60s when they used DDT.
Yeah.
One of Mary's funniest stories, because she had a lot of them, was when her uncle, who was a huge wheat farmer in Oklahoma, would send her and her cousin out to hold the flags for the crop dusters, and they'd end up white and then just play snowmen for the rest of the day. Yeah, it was funny till it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And there were so many. When I left that little town of 12,000, Mary was the 8th or 9th person that had died of a brain tumor in the last 3 years. There were 13 people that had Parkinson's, and about 18 of us had blood cancers.
Oh my goodness.
And so it was, I think there was just a lot going on environmentally.
That's what immediately like flipped in my head when you had mentioned that small town in Kansas, big wheat community, big farming community, pesticides, glyphosate being sprayed on everything. And then of course you brought up the DDT at that point for her growing up.
Well, and we had, as is true of most Midwest towns, but because we were right between these two rivers, it was pretty swampy. And so in fall and spring, especially spring, the city would come and spray, but never tell us. And I never really thought about how awful that was until Mary was dying, and my daughter played a lot of tennis. So we'd taken her with my parents, and we were watching my daughter play a tennis match, and we're at the largest child playground park in the city. And here comes the city spraying just clouds of pesticide over all the children. And my parents are like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Because they're from Oregon, environmentally conscious.
Right.
What's going on? And I'm like, oh, they're just spraying the pesticide.
It kind of hit you like, whoa.
Yeah. And I kind of woke up in that moment. But this had been going on for 30 years, so it was just a part of life.
Right.
And I said, let's get Mary out of here.
Right.
And so we bundled up, took off quickly, and we even got Bree out of that tennis match. And I've thought about it since. I thought, oh my gosh, no wonder everybody was so sick.
And it's so sad because, as is the case with the overwhelming majority of people who are on some like agricultural department in that small little town or working for the city and makes the decision to spray pesticides, or even in these examples, these oncologists, it's tough because both you and I know that they are overwhelmingly misled to believe something that is just fundamentally not true about health in the human body, what produces health, what produces disease, and at the same time recognizing that they are good, well-intentioned people.
They are. Many of them were my friends and wouldn't have done anything to hurt me.
Right.
And if they would me, they certainly wouldn't have married. They adored her.
Right. Well, like even thinking back to the example when I asked you your initial diagnosis, how much that brought on the psychosomatic development of those symptoms. And it was that you really trusted that guy because he was a good guy, but then that relationship also led to you to trust the cancer diagnosis and really like self-identify with that to some degree. And that's where it's like, it's such a tough thing to balance out, both acknowledging that these are well-intentioned people, but we still need to also lead people to what is true and clearly point out what is not. But how much do you think this experience with your wife passing away, especially, in the way that she did, led to you developing the second cancer that you developed?
Wholeheartedly. I don't think there's any question whatsoever. like I told you, I rarely cried. After she died, I was so broken that I cried all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It was a really strange experience for me to not even be able to talk about the weather.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't even say her name. As a matter of fact, my family knew I was starting to do better after the swim because I was saying her name. I didn't realize it. It had happened organically over the 22 days I swam the Willamette, that healing. But all of a sudden I was talking about how funny she was and what she did and not bursting into tears. And so I think it had all of it to do. As a matter of fact, the ironic thing, Alec, is I was considered a grief expert in the Midwest. And because I'd done a lot of grief work and I had been a weekly columnist for 8 years before she died, and for a lot of the small towns in the Midwest, and written a lot of articles on grief. And when I myself was having such traumatic grief, I realized that everything I had known is just what I had read. I even called up a couple of my clients and apologized.
Wow.
Because it was so overwhelmingly awful and unpredictable. And while I knew that here, I didn't know it here.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a difference between intellectualizing it and then actually feeling and experiencing it yourself.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's start now on what made Dean Hall who he is now. Obviously, like, those experiences absolutely led up to that, but now, like, the forest bathing, swim in like insane temperatures, insane environments, swimming miles and miles, that version of Dean Hall came about as a result of this traumatic experience of your wife passing away, but then that, you know, led to a cancer diagnosis. So let's start with the actual diagnosis itself. Yeah.
The diagnosis happened. I knew things weren't doing well when in 2011 I started feeling sick, and the first time I had chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and often that's accompanied by non-Hodgkin's small cell lymphoma, but I hadn't had that. But my daughter was in her senior year when Mary died of high school, and so she went on to college and up in the Northwest because she always identified as an Oregonian. And so she went up there, and I went up to visit her once, and I wasn't feeling well, and I was kind of stressed, and so I rubbed my clavicle, and it felt like there was just gravel underneath. And I noticed my lymph nodes had started to grow a little bit, and my armpits hurt a bit. But I didn't think much about it. You know, you just kind of keep going. And, but pretty quickly I thought I better go talk to Aaron. So he got me into another oncologist because Dr. Gundape had left. And that's when I was diagnosed again, almost exactly a year to the day of Mary dying.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying this episode, please consider sharing it with at least one friend or family member who you think could benefit from hearing it. You help us grow and reach more people by sharing it with those around you. Also, be sure to head to the show notes to check out our membership offerings, membership marketplace, and more. We all know that Big Ag is poisoning our food supply, and Big Pharma's so-called medicine is straight up poison. What most people aren't aware of, though, is that most supplements are also filled with artificial sweeteners, dyes, GMOs, glyphosate, and a host of other toxic ingredients, even many of the more natural supplements. My good buddy James Benefico dedicated his life to crafting the world's cleanest, most nutritious organic supplements after a pre-workout energy drink caused heart palpitations so severe that he almost landed up in the ER. Organic Muscle was born, revolutionizing sports nutrition by using exclusively non-GMO ingredients from USDA organic farms. Since then, tens of thousands of people, including myself, have leveled up their fitness and their health with Organic Muscle's award-winning natural pre-workout. There's no jitters, no heart palpitations, no itchy skin, just nourishing organic food and herb-based ingredients for clean, sustained energy, strength, endurance, and recovery. Numerous studies have shown that Tonka Ali is the most effective herb in the world for naturally boosting testosterone levels. And we know that testosterone levels are depleting all over the world because of what's put in the food supply, what we're exposed to. Organic Muscle has the world's first fully organic Tonka Ali supplement. I only support and promote things that I actually use, and I can say I legitimately use Organic Muscle products. Use code FORWARD15 at checkout for 15% off at organicmuscle.com. Okay, so you got this new diagnosis.
Yeah.
And you had already beaten cancer, resolved cancer the first time. You'd done it naturally the first time too.
Right.
So with this second diagnosis, what was the story sort of going on in your head? Did you know that it was related to the death of your first wife?
I felt so. I wasn't really, the first time was so much about fear and anger. And everybody, especially with my faith background, they're like, well, weren't you angry at God? No, why would I be angry at God? We live in a broken world. It's not, he didn't make this happen.
We have free will. We made these choices.
Yeah.
God didn't create glyphosate as an example.
I mean, that didn't even occur to me. But the overwhelming, abject sadness and this feeling lost for the first time in my adult life. I hadn't realized it, but insidiously, my whole adult personality or identity had been around being Mary's husband. Moving to this small town, if your grandparents didn't grow up there, you're an outsider. And the first couple of years, it really bothered me because I was a teacher in town. I was loving the kids. Things were going great. But people from the town wouldn't call me by name. The kids all did. But all the other people, oh, you're Mary's husband. And after a while, that's just kind of who I became. And it was a good gig. So I was happy to be Mary's husband until I was no longer Mary's husband. And then everywhere I went, people are like, oh, there's Mary's husband. No, I want to be. I'm not. And there wasn't a rock, a cobblestone, a brick, a tree that I didn't have some memory associated with her. And so everywhere I went, it was just like this. You've heard of sensory deprivation tanks. This was a sensory overstimulation tank. Yeah. There was just nowhere I could turn that didn't remind me of her, have a memory of her, or somebody asking me how I was doing. And all I wanted to do is scream, how the hell do you think I'm doing?
Right. I could imagine a small town.
It was horrible. Yeah. It was horrible. And then my mother-in-law, who I think she was persistently mentally ill, but most guys say that about their mother-in-laws. But sadly...
For the record, Carol, if you ever watch this, I do not say that about you.
Sadly, mine was. She's gone now, and so I feel okay to say that without defaming her character. But she went, the more dysfunctional a family is, or a person, the more they only have two ways to view the whole rest of the world, either as their hero or savior, or enemy as scapegoat. And so she went around blaming me for Mary's death.
Wow.
And I didn't see that coming. Here I had loved their daughter as best I could, and I think pretty well, for 30 years, and them. And her. And I had heard about it and read about it, but I'd never seen anybody become so dedicated to ruining another person as she and Mary's
Especially when you're already
were.
in a grieving process yourself too, your daughter,
it was 10 to 12 times a day that people would stop me and say, well, did you hear what Gladys said? I just want to check to see if any of that's true. And at first, I'd say bad things about Gladys, but that's not my character, and so it didn't feel true to who I am. And so finally, I did two things. I started shopping for groceries at Walmart, which, especially in a small town, you're not going to get organic back then. And so not great food at midnight, just so I wouldn't be hit several times with these stories. Yeah. And then the other thing is saying, well, you've known me for 30 years. Does any of that sound like the person you've known? But I felt like I'd not only lost my wife, but my identity in this town. Because, W.C. Fields used to say, tell a small lie. Some people believe you. Tell a whopper, and just about everybody will believe it.
Yes, especially in a small town.
Yeah. And she was telling some big whoppers. One that even made me look like a sexual predator.
Oh my goodness.
So, and the more you try to defend yourself, the more guilty you look. So I just didn't know what to do. It somewhat died down, but after I was diagnosed a year later, by 2 years later, I was just ready to be done. I'd been lonely and homesick for Oregon, and I'd stayed there because of the cute little Kansas farm girl, and she was no longer there. So I decided to go back home, not realizing I was giving up the last anchor of my adult identity, and that was my private practice that by now was thriving because I'd worked so hard and been so diligent to serve well. And so all of a sudden, I ended up back in Portland, renting for the first time in 30 years, which felt odd, having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars out of pocket, and so pretty broke for the first time in a long time, and in a dark little duplex living by myself for the first time, because I went from my parents to college, living in the dorms, to married to marry. I never lived by myself. I hadn't realized that either. And so all of a sudden I'm alone in this, I call it a dark little duplex. It was really a nice place, but it felt dark there.
Yeah. And so from there, what was your path to tackle this cancer diagnosis?
I wish I could say, man, I got my head screwed on straight and I made no mistakes and I was a champion.
Yeah.
No, I binge watched on Netflix almost all day for several months, and mostly The Walking Dead. And
you
then
probably felt like The Walking Dead yourself, right?
Smart man. I couldn't figure. I kept scratching my head. What's my fascination with this? I mean, it's good acting, good writing, all that kind of stuff. And then I realized, I feel like I've been through an apocalypse,
right?
And I feel like a walking zombie,
right?
So I understand both sides.
right. So I know at one point you picked up this journal from when you were a little kid, right? And so what sort of led to that? Because obviously, like I think this goes without saying at this point, because of the grief and the total shift in identity and having to pick up your life and move to Oregon, which was probably great because you were back where you grew up and you felt a longing to be there for this whole time anyway, but still just having gone through all that, was it this picking up this journal and reading what you had said when you were a little kid that sort of made you?
No, it was my cancer diagnosis and where I had gotten.
So was the cancer diagnosis before you moved to Oregon?
It was 2011. I moved back in 2012.
Okay.
And by 2013, I had been in such a funk for so long, and the lymphoma had gotten very aggressive, as had the leukemia, that I was down to 152 pounds, and I'm 6'1.5", and right now I weigh 215.
Yeah.
So
you're a fit dude, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
You're a fit guy.
For an old effer.
Right. You're a fit guy.
Yeah, thank you. But if you would have seen me at 152, I was skeletal. You could even see my pelvic bones.
I mean, you're about my height and I'm 215, so I can imagine dropping down to that weight. Like, my goodness.
Yeah. It was, my family jokes that I've never been a pretty boy, but I was ugly with a capital Ugh. I mean, it was so bad. As a matter of fact, the lymph nodes had swollen to the point where they were beyond my jawline and I could barely turn my neck. And these had swollen the rest of my neck up. And then I had several around my groin and abdomen. And then I had one so large under my right armpit, my oncologist called it my hockey puck because it was the size and shape almost exactly of a hockey puck.
That's a big.
And so I looked disfigured.
Yeah.
And so I made the intentional choice to never look in the mirror. And one morning I was feeling really miserable, Saturday morning in August of 2013. And at about 9 o'clock in the morning, I amble out of bed, shuffle into the bathroom, and I accidentally looked up and I met my own eyes. And I was shocked. Not only did this guy look really awful, but his eyes looked so sad. And I thought, I'd never felt suicidal in my life. And I thought, you know what? I've had a good life. I had a good run. I had always wanted, my main goal in life was to have a good love and a good family and to be of service to others. And both in my teaching and in the thousands and thousands of hours I did serving others in therapy, I'd done that. I'd always wanted to write a book. I'd done that. And it had done okay. And I'd had a good run. And so if I just let the leukemia and lymphoma take me, nobody will guess that I gave up. And then the next drum beat was, yeah, that's an entirely selfish thought. You've got a daughter who just lost her mama.
Right.
And if you let this happen, she will be an orphan at 21. That being a father has always been my greatest privilege and my biggest goal in life, to be intentional and to be healthy and strong and kind and connected. As a matter of fact, right before I finished graduate school, she was born a month before I graduated from graduate school in family therapy. And I read that this study that I won't go into very long, but they found that if a father takes his daughter on a daddy-daughter date, same day, same time of day, for only an hour every week, that it changes the trajectory of her life. This was done a 20-year longitudinal study. And back in the 60s and 70s, there was high rate of teen pregnancy, high rate of drug abuse. They only, out of the 100 girls they had, 0 got pregnant. Only 3 took drugs. But what they also found is, I can't remember the exact percentage back in the 70s of girls that were going to college and graduating, but it was lower than you'd think. It was like 40 or 50%, if that. 80% of these girls went to school. And then the real thing they found that surprised them is 87 out of the 100 had a higher level income than their fellow college graduates after school. So every Friday, I would take Bree to breakfast and did her whole life. And so being her father was probably my deepest purpose in life. And I knew from studying Viktor Frankl's work and Man's Search for Meaning, I had helped many clients overcome trauma and tragedy by becoming very passionate about a purpose. So I knew I had to have a purpose. And I also know, and I'm sure you know this, but most people still don't, even therapists. And I'm like, my gosh, don't you guys read? But the power of questions, the brain by its very nature has to answer every question you ask. Well, if you do the math on that, we ask some pretty awful questions. And if you change the questions, it changes the trajectory of your day and your life. But a lot of people know, having watched, different game shows like Jeopardy, that if you ask a question about trivia, maybe an hour, maybe a day later, you'll be brushing your teeth and all of a sudden the answer will be there. What they don't know is you can do that with the deepest questions of your life.
Wow.
So prayerfully in meditation, I started asking, what is my purpose now? What would be the best use of the time I have left on earth? And the longest I'd ever had to wait for that kind of deep answer, Alec, was 7 to 10 days. 3 weeks later, it's crickets. And I'm just like, oh, okay, God, universe, whatever you want to call it, I would throw me a bone here.
Right.
Nothing. But I remember actually saying that out loud, throw me a bone here. Mm-hmm. And I looked around, and I'd lived in this little duplex for 6 months, and it looked like a frat boy was there. I hadn't unpacked anything. I hadn't even put my bed together. I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor. I'm like, okay, before purpose, maybe you should act like an adult, Dean, and unpack the boxes.
Your purpose right now is to put your house together.
to be an actual functional adult.
Right.
Yeah. And so I started doing that, and I came upon this box that my mom had collected a lot of my childhood things. And one of the first ones was a journal I'd been forced to keep in the 6th grade, because most guys are not going to keep a journal in the 6th grade. And at least when I was growing up. And so I thought, let's see what the 11-year-old Dean had to say. So I opened it up. First page says, when I get old, I gotta, not have to, not got to, gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel. And to this day, I don't know if you can see the hair stand, a shot of electricity just went through me. And it was like, hell yes. I'd forgotten that, boy. And that's all I'd ever wanted to be until soccer had taken over my life. That's the only thing I ever wanted to do. Because through Dad and his climbing, I'd met a few that had climbed Everest. And one of them in particular was sponsored by National Geographic. That's a cool way to live.
Right.
I'd totally forgotten about that. And I thought, that's it. And then I started running the numbers. Okay, I know my blood counts and my immune system probably wouldn't be able to handle elevation, much less probably the food at Kathmandu. But I can swim the channel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. And then just as quickly, that's insane. Are you effing nuts?
Yeah, here you are, like 152 pounds, just swollen all over the place, cancer riddled through your body.
Right.
And just starting the thought to get your life back together.
Right.
And you're like, I'm going to swim in the English Channel.
Yeah.
So you have this conflict in your head of like...
I wrote down, I think, 13 reasons why this is absolutely insane. Mm-hmm. By then I was 53, almost 54. I was dying of cancer. I was broke. I was alone. I mean, just every logical reason, it made no sense. But every time I thought about it, even to this day, I just got so excited. Yeah. I felt alive. And so Aaron, that I've talked so much about, called him up. I'm like, Aaron, I finally got it. He's like, well, we've been hoping you would. What's going on? And I said, I'm going to swim the English Channel. He's like, what? He's like, Dean, because what I had forgotten, and to this day, it's just hit me why this sounded so insane to him. A year earlier, in 2012, this is 2013, I was trying to prove to Bree that I was strong and I was coming back. So I swam across a lake in Oklahoma, not knowing I was swimming through blue-green algae.
Oh, boy.
And it went up my nose, and I almost died of viral meningitis. And he's like, have you forgotten viral meningitis? It took you 6 months to come back. Are you crazy? He's like, you barely came back. And it was so bad that for the first 3 days, my brain was so swollen, I couldn't read.
I mean, I can imagine the toxicity in that lake in Oklahoma to have like blue-green algae, have to remediate it. Like, my goodness. And that just went up your nose.
Yeah. And I mean, if I would have been thinking, it was just a big petri dish of bacteria. What was I thinking?
Right.
But I wanted to show her I was strong, and I'd always swam across things. And so I thought I'll swim across this lake and back. It was only about a mile.
Yeah.
And I did, and we thought it was great until 3 days later, this poor little girl, I'm out of my head. She can't wake me up. She's got to take me to the hospital.
Oh, my goodness.
Then I was out for 38 hours. They didn't think I was going to make it.
Oh, my goodness.
And when I came back, I woke up, and this is when I'd lost the 60 pounds just in that time frame.
Wow.
And I had lesions and scabs all over my body. And yeah, it was really quite a sight. And for the next 3 months, it was like I had a migraine and a flu, kind of like what the neurologist told, or neurosurgeon told us would happen to Mary, because my brain was so swollen. I had to kind of teach myself how to walk again.
My goodness.
And so when I called Aaron only a year later, he's like, you really want to swim again? I'm like, yeah. He's like, but Dean, you get in a public pool with your immune system, even though there's no blue-green algae, I hope, in a swimming pool, it's a petri dish too.
Right.
I'm like, what do you want me to do? Die sitting on a couch watching Wheel of Fortune? I'm not going to go out that way.
Right.
I got to do something. He's like, well, at least promise me to wear a nose plug. I'm like, what? He's like, wear a nose plug. I'm like, yeah, I can do that. And so even though it makes me look even dorkier, every time I swim, even to this day, I'm not taking any chances. I'm wearing a nose plug. And so I do. But that first time, then that next day, even without telling my parents or anybody, I got in the pool, and the channel is about 20 to 22 miles across, give or take how you hit the currents and everything. I knew I couldn't do 22 laps, but I could do 22 lengths. And so I decided actually to do 20 lengths. And usually that's 10 laps. It'd take me 8 minutes, maybe. Took me over an hour. But it felt so good because I'd been doing triathlons for years. And so I'd done hundreds of miles of lap swimming in a pool. It was the first time, Alec, I felt like me again. And it felt so good. And so I got my 10 laps done. But then the way my dad is, ever since I was a little kid, he'd push me to the limit. And then he'd say, do one more. And so I did one more. And it just felt great. The only problem is I had lymphoma. I didn't know anything about the lymph system.
Right.
The lymph system is the strainer for all the bacteria and all the toxins in your body. It doesn't work unless you move. And so one of the hardest challenges of preparing for a 187-mile swim is you've got to work up to swimming several miles a day.
Right.
Well, in doing so, I would swim, and the swimming wasn't the hard part. It was about 30 minutes to an hour later, all those toxins would flush through my body, and I would feel like I had a really intense flu, non-vomiting, for an hour or two after.
Did you know at this time that this was simply your body's healing response of like, whoa, I'm flushing these toxins out of me now?
Yeah, I didn't think of it as a healing response. I just thought of it as a pain in the ass.
Yeah, right. Especially at the time when you're in it, you have cancer, my goodness. But like how beautiful that you're getting your lymph moving, and that's what's helping to resolve it. And of course, when you're going through a healing crisis, the healing phase of anything, whether mental or physical, is going to be extremely challenging. And it almost feels like it gets way worse before it starts getting better.
Oh, yeah. Well, even if I wasn't sick, I've helped many people since, because one of the reasons I did this, I wanted, my main reason was, at least that I published, is I wanted cancer patients to see that they don't have to be defined by their diagnosis, and to refuse to be so. But then also, I'd been around the block, and I'd gotten to listen to thousands and thousands of people over 30 years tell me the most intimate details of their life. And so I kind of figured out a few things on how to accomplish stuff. And so I thought, if a 54-year-old cancer patient can swim for 187 miles in 40-degree water, and, you know, I always wanted to be special. I always wanted to be on a Wheaties box or, you know, in the Olympics. I wasn't. And you know, I found that the power of my story is not that I'm extraordinary, it's that I'm extremely ordinary. And so if an ordinary schlub like me can do that, anybody, if they follow the same principles, can. And so I teach people, one of the things I do is coach people going after their big dream using the same things I did. I tell everybody, you do what I did, you'll get what I got. I wish I was special, I'm not, but you can be thankful I'm not. But that period is what I call the desert of big dreams. When you start, of course, I didn't tell many people, and the ones I did were horrified. It even made my mom cry.
When you said like, you wanted to do this?
Yeah, she's like, oh, please don't. She's like, please wait till you're in remission. That was the one drumbeat I heard from everybody. Wait till you're in remission. I'm like, I might not ever be in remission. What? I'm not going to wait. And so I didn't. But a lot of times when people start a big dream, there's some fanfare. But what happens then is they walk into the desert, and pretty soon they find themselves totally alone, and they can't really find their way back, but they can't see the end. And they don't know how to really get there, and nobody cares. And I dealt with that a lot, but I knew I would. And after everything I'd been through, nothing's quite as bad. You know, the first time I decided I would love to become the first person to swim the entire length of the Willamette River, I was 24. And I was in amazing shape. But I might not have been able to do it because it was so damn hard mentally.
Right.
But after everything I've been through, and this is what I think we all don't realize, these hardships, these challenges, these trials, these really difficult times that we go through are developing the muscle to help you to be who I believe you were created to be and do what you were designed to do.
Amen.
And when people, after a while, we started getting a lot of media attention as we were doing this swim. We didn't for the first 100 miles because I was just a crazy old cancer patient. And they thought, this is not a story that's going to end well.
Right.
So we're not going to publish this. We're going to ignore this guy. But once I'd gone past 100 miles, then they started really taking notice, and it just swelled. And that's when it became fun, but it wasn't that for quite some time.
How did you, aside from doing laps in a pool, did you do any like cold water immersion therapy? And like, you might not have called it that at that time, but you're like, hey, okay, look, I'm going to, again, we've talked a little bit.
Yeah,
Wim Hof wasn't a thing back then. So you're like,
he was, but I'd never heard
you
of
never, okay. He was a thing, but not like he is now, right?
No.
So for you, you're like, okay, I'm going to have to swim in something that's extremely cold. What do I do to prepare my body for that? So what did you do?
I was thinking right around Christmas, I was feeling so good and all my numbers were going in the right direction and my head was starting to clear. I wasn't just abjectly sad and grieving every moment of every day. And I felt like I was getting traction in at least one area of my life. By Christmas, I was swimming a mile or two and not having that terrible toxic downturn afterwards every time. And I was starting to gain muscle back, and that felt good. And I was getting out of the pool, and the thought occurred to me, who cares if another middle-aged man puts on a Speedo and swims to France? It does the world no good, and in my case, it won't be a pretty picture. And so I started asking again prayerfully, what would do the world some good? And that's when I decided to switch it over to the Willamette.
Wow.
And your question was, though, I think I got off of that.
Well, what you did in terms to get ready for the cold that you'd experience.
And so knowing that because I thought I could probably handle the channel, but 187 miles of the Willamette in June, which would be, sometimes it gets pretty low in spots. So I knew it'd have to still be pretty high. And it's largely a snowmelt river. So I knew it was just going to be bone-crushingly cold. And it was 42 to 45 the first 16 days. I think might have gone up to 48 a couple times, first 16 days of the 22. And that sounds warm, until you've been in 42-degree
No,
water.
that's insanely cold water.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's like colder than a lot of people do for, quote, ice baths.
Right.
Yeah,
it is.
That's cold water.
And to have my face in it, that was the hard thing.
Yeah.
And my hands. And so I thought, with my immune system and all the challenges I've had, and I promised my daughter, we'd talked about it quite a bit then. She was still skeptical, but she begged me, hey, at least do whatever you need to do. She said, Dad, you're a smart guy. Research it, do whatever you need to do to stay safe. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And I got to thinking about that promise, and I thought, if it's that cold, I really need to start acclimatizing and conditioning my body to withstand that cold. So that's the first time, January 3rd of 2014. So I've been doing daily ice baths now for a little over 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm the OG.
The OG, yeah.
Everybody thinks it's Wim. Yeah. Sorry, Wim. As far as America goes.
Right. You're the Wim Hof of America, let's say. Yeah. Or
And
maybe you could say Wim Hof is the Dean Hall of Europe.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to be the Wim Hof of America. And, nothing against Wim, but I think I'm prettier.
Yeah.
So, and that's not saying a lot. But anyway, I thought I need to start acclimatizing and readying my body. And so and in January, we get water from the Bull Run Reservoir, which is up in the mountains. And so it was coming out at about probably 48 to 45. I didn't put a thermometer in it. I didn't know that was a thing. And I got it. It just felt cold, ice cold to me at that time. And I didn't know the science that in order to really affect the immune system and have that brain boost, you only have to stay in 90 seconds. I stayed in 2 minutes. Just because I knew that's what I thought I should have to stay in just as a starter. Mm-hmm. But it was a crazy experience. The most beautiful part of that was for 3 years, ever since the day Mary was diagnosed, I had what I called the 5,000 pounds on my chest. And I'd wake up and I called it the 1 second thud. I'd wake up, 1,001, thud, boom, it was there. Mary died. What am I going to do? Yeah. And I get out of the tub and, I'm cold, but I feel really good. I'm like, what the hell? And then I even look down at my chest. I'm like, 5,000 pounds is gone.
Wow. How
did that happen? And so my therapist brain is just going crazy trying to think of this or that.
Yeah, trying to figure out how it works.
And, I hadn't heard, I'd read a lot on mind body, but it's 10 years ago. We were nowhere near where we are now of understanding things. And I looked down at my chest and it's gone. And I didn't have to do cognitive behavioral therapy. I didn't have to do basic grief strategies. I didn't have to journal. I didn't have to meditate. I didn't have to breathe. What the hell? And I'm like, this couldn't be this easy. And so I thought, well, let's see if it comes back. I'm sure it probably will. It's grief. And about 3 or 4 hours later, thud, it was there. So let's do this again. So I filled up the tub, got in, boom, gone. And I thought, okay, I want to be very careful now because I want to really allow myself to go through the grief process. But
right, you were kind of already thinking like, is this suppressing or is this helping me heal? Right,
exactly. At least on the emotional level.
Right, totally.
But I thought, what a glorious, beautiful gift this is. I even said this at the time because I was living alone and I never lived alone before, and it gave my daughter the creeps. But I talk to myself all the time. I don't know when it started, but I just said, this is the first gift of the big dream. Because I believe when you have the courage to follow a dream, especially if it feels impossible, it starts bringing gifts to you as you walk out of that desert. And that was the first gift, to know that if I'm really suffering and I just need a break and I can't get it through all the conventional means that all I have to do is get my big sorry butt in an ice bath and I'm golden, at least for an hour or two. Little did I know it was just flooding my brain with serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin and norepinephrine and all these wonderful feel-good hormones and chemicals.
Could you say that in a way this is possibly like rewiring neural pathways or creating new neural pathways in a way?
I think it would be silly, and I'm no neurosurgeon
of course,
or neurologist, but I think it would be absolutely silly not to say that.
It just it fundamentally shifted your mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And made me feel like such a badass.
Yeah.
Yeah, because all of a sudden, after a week or so of 2 minutes in 48-degree water, I was just whistling Dixie. It was too easy. So I started adding in ice and more ice and bags of ice. And all of a sudden, I'm starting to feel, here's this guy that's got cancer and in his 50s, and I'm feeling like Superman.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of the Iceman.
Yeah.
I was the Iceman.
Right.
Yeah. And I wasn't even telling my parents that I was doing this because I thought it would scare them. But it just developed, and I've seen this happen time and time again, more routinely than not. Doesn't matter the gender, the race, the culture. It engenders a feeling of quiet confidence after a few weeks where you're walking around, you hit a tough moment in the day, yeah, I did that. Or you hear people whining and complaining about the weather or something, you'll be like, pussy. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I
hope I can talk like that.
No, I cuss all the time. Okay. Yes, you're fine.
Because you're like, yeah, you didn't get in an ice bath, obviously, if you're worried about that.
Well, it just shows you that, you directly experienced the power of each of us to overcome, any circumstance.
Right.
If this almost sounds cliche, but it is true. If we put our mind to it, I'd say your mind, body, and spirit, though, in this case.
Well, I'd already experienced that. I climbed Mount Hood when I was 10. That wasn't easy for a 10-year-old. And my first mountain I climbed when I was 8. And my dad, climbing alpine in the Cascades is an interesting affair because you usually start at 10 or midnight and climb through the night because all the snow is hard and you don't have to worry about avalanche as much, and you don't have to worry about rock fall as much. You summit by 7 or 8 and then you get the hell off the mountain. And so climbing through the night with my parents, what felt like all my life, had taught me how to crawl inside my head. And then all these soccer games, everybody be whining and complaining. I'd be having a great time. And then triathlons, I wasn't that gifted. But I felt like I could withstand pain better than anybody. So I'd always been, and sadly, most of the people that love me that have had to live with me say I'm the most stubborn person they've ever known. Since my wife died, I've promised I now look at stubbornness as misplaced strength. And I try to use it for good. But it always kind of was my superpower. But then to have strength biologically and organically through, and when I say biologically, I don't have to crawl into the backside of my brain and just handle it. It was just snapped through this shock. Was a fantastic experience and something really interesting that I've seen replicated with, I can now say, over 100 of my clients that I've worked with.
Incredible. There's so many threads I want to pull on here because there's the cancer resolving itself. Right. There's the reconnecting with nature in a very deep way, because I know you're now very big into forest bathing and are a proponent of overwhelmingly our health issues that we deal with, especially in modernity, are a result of disconnecting ourselves from the natural world. But let's start first with the cancer. So after some time in nature, in spending hours and hours and hours in cold, you went back to your oncologist, and what happened?
Yeah, I I thought I finished the swim. It took me 22 days to swim the 187 miles. And that was the hardest challenge. And quietly, and you're the first person I've ever told this publicly. And I just told my own father, who was my guide boater. And that was one of the biggest gifts that happened. He was 79 at the time. And I had 6 guide boaters, because to swim a river, you can see about a quarter mile ahead or 10 feet or maybe 10 yards, but danger is always about 30 or 40 yards. So you need somebody in a kayak picking the line, warning boaters if you're in that kind of climate.
Right.
But it's mostly around what they call strainers, logs in the water, or rapids or anything like that. And a month before my swim, I had 6 guide boaters, and 4 of them dropped out in the same week. And I'm like, and so I was talking to him, what am I going to do? And he's like, I know what you're going to do. I said, what's that? And he's like, I'll do it. I'm like, Dad, you're 79. Doesn't matter. Dad, you've never been in a kayak. I'll learn. And so he joined me, and we got some actual guide boaters to school him. And
that's so cool, though.
It really was.
Yeah.
What a gift to have this man that I had always thought of as Superman.
Right.
And it had been young buck, old buck stuff for lots of years. And we realized that even though we'd done a lot of backpacking together, a lot of times Mom had been with us, or my siblings. And then in later life, a lot of times we'd gone off together, but just for a day or two. And to have 22 days, 24/7 on this beautiful adventure that was insanely difficult together was just a gift. Just
incredible.
A gift. Yeah. Probably for me, bigger than holding a world record, getting that time with him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, what was your question? I
don't know. That was so beautiful that I don't even remember. The going to see the oncologist after this experience. So you swam, you hold this world record now.
And I felt amazing.
Yeah.
And
can you state the world record one more time for emphasis?
I am the first person in history to have swum the entire length of the Willamette River.
Wow.
And
while you were...
I was 54 and an active cancer patient.
Incredible.
Yeah. And the hardest part of that journey was the cold. I would, even with the 3 mil wetsuit, I would have to get out about every 30 to 45 minutes because I'd be going into what's called thrombosis, or deep core throttle hypothermia, where you can feel your internal organs banging against your rib cage and starting to get really fuzzy. And so we'd pull over after 45 minutes of swimming, and I'd have to do jumping jacks or burpees or run in place to warm up.
Wow.
Then I'd eat as much as I could without throwing up, get in, do it all over again for about 8 hours a day. I averaged 10 to 12 miles a day, which in Ironman terms, an Ironman marathon is 3 miles. So I was doing 3 to 5 marathons a day for 22 days in 40-degree water.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's hard, but not as hard as everything I'd been through. And every time it would start to get a little too hard, I think, you know what? I'm not in an oncology ward. You know what? I'm not at a funeral.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm not watching The Walking Dead.
Right.
You know, I'm no longer feeling like The Walking Dead.
Right.
And it was just this beautiful thing that happened. And so I had always thought recently that only weeks, because we had scheduled chemo and radiation for right after the swim, because my oncologist, who is a world-class oncologist, world's number 3 researcher, as a matter of fact, thought that it would so decimate my strength that I would need chemo and radiation. So I relented and we scheduled it, but I didn't go.
Wow.
Because I felt so good. And I didn't want to hear that I was doing bad, because I'd had this wonderful experience and I felt so alive. And I went back in my journals right before we wrote the book. I didn't go back till January. I put it off 3 times. And when I went back, we were going to take the blood test to see if chemo and radiation was necessary. And then we were going to do chemo and radiation that day. And so I took the blood test, and I'm waiting in the little room by myself for over an hour. And I started to get the shakes. I started to get a panic attack. I thought, oh man, I've never had to wait this long. This is bad. This is bad. And then he comes in and he says, well, Dean, I don't know how to tell you this. And anytime I'd ever heard an oncologist say this, it was a hammer blow.
Right.
And so I thought, oh, geez, here we go. And then he saw me and he's like, oh, Dean, I'm so sorry. No, it's not that. And I was shocked. And I said, what? And he said, I don't know how to tell you this. Your leukemia is gone. I don't know what happened. I've never seen this happen before. And that's when he said, if I hadn't diagnosed you myself, I would have thought you had been misdiagnosed. I can't find any real evidence that you have chronic lymphocytic leukemia.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you feel after you heard that?
Disbelief. It was almost as shocking as the original diagnosis, only positive, whereas the first was, of course, negative.
Yeah.
But and then once it hit me, I was just elated.
Yeah.
And I'd become so connected to the river. At first, it was the Willamette River. And then after a few days, I started calling it Big Blue. And then after a few days, I started feeling it. And as crazy as it sounds, hearing it. And I started calling it Mama River. And yeah, so it was just another gift that Mama River gave me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So how much of your resolving cancer this time do you attribute to, and this is probably a rhetorical question, but I just want to hear what you say, to the immersion in cold, facing yourself and having to face yourself in a very challenging way,
Right.
like overcome some, let's say just mental turmoil at
Right.
that time, psycho-spiritual, you could say as
Right.
well. And then also, immersing yourself in nature.
Yeah. The oncologist thought, and I thought, that once the leukemia abated, that the lymphoma would just kind of dry up and go away because my immune system would have an easier chance to regulate. It did the exact opposite. It started getting very aggressive. Mm-hmm. And he was surprised. I was surprised. And so he wanted me to do chemo again. And I said, well, nature healed me once. And he's like, oh no, here we go. He's like, what are you going to do? Swim another river? I said, no, give me some time. I want to do an internet search. He's like, an internet search? And I said, yeah, there's a field called ecotherapy or nature therapy. There's got to be something out there. Mm-hmm. He's like, all right, Dean, but do you mind if I schedule this? And I said, well, give me a week and we'll talk. And so he's down in California, University of California, San Diego. And I was up in Portland. So I said, can we have a phone consult? And I'll run my ideas by you if I have any. Well, I did a massive internet search and I found Dr. King Lee from Nippon University's research, and it looked really good. He'd taken 50 men, and only for an hour or two of walking meditatively through a forest, he found that it boosted their NK cells, or natural killer cancer-killing cells, 300 times for 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, I'm not a nuclear scientist, or what I'd consider a mathematician, but if that does it for 2 weeks and I go every week, and not just for an hour, but for all day, maybe this thing will become exponential. And so I did. I started going up the Ramona Falls Trail in the Mount Hood Wilderness and getting a mile or so off the trail deep in what I considered an old growth forest. I'm not sure it is, but the trees are big and it just feels peaceful. And very soon I realized it might have been 100 years or more since they've seen humans.
Right.
And so it's just my secret spot.
Uh-huh.
And things started changing. I'd go up there, headlamp in Thursday nights after a day of work, and then sleep all Thursday, Friday morning. And then Friday, I would get up meditate, pray, stay there a lot of the day, and then dip in the Sandy River only a few miles from where the glacier is, absorb all these ancient glacial minerals, and then cold immersion, because I mean it's coming right out of the glacier. Right. And so it's probably about 36, 38 degrees, really cold and just wonderful. And I started realizing how powerful the forest was too with my trauma, because I'd had really interrupted sleep for the 3 years. After the swim, the nightmares kind of went away. Always before it was 1 or 2 or 5. After the swim, maybe 1 a couple times a week, but I never woke up crying. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, I hadn't, even though when it was very acute at first and I cried all the time, I wouldn't wake up crying. Mm-hmm. But out there in the forest, usually at about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock a.m., I would just wake up sobbing. Mm. And I thought, you know what? Nobody's going to see me. Nobody's ever going to know. I am here alone with the trees. And I know my body, it just felt organic. It felt like a splinter that needed to be pulled.
So you just wailed, let your emotions out, yelled, screamed, all of it. I'd imagine.
Well, maybe not that. I didn't want to scare the animals.
Got it. But you really let yourself feel.
I just let myself feel and release, because the body was designed to feel and release. Right. I've taught everybody for years, and it's probably from this, that I believe the emotional system works like the digestive system. You chew up life's experiences, be they good or bad. That's exactly what the body, mind, and spirit needs in order to be healthy, growing, strong. Right. But there are a lot of waste products. Those waste products are all the stuff we try to avoid: anger, sadness, fear, hurt, loneliness, guilt, shame. We try to make them mean something they don't. Mm. They're just psycho-spiritual waste products. And the body, being wise and wonderful, will do just like the bladder. It'll tell you when it's time to let go, and then it'll show you how to let go. You know, I tell everybody, you don't see, unless a child's being abused or neglected, you don't see a stressed out 2-year-old. Because they're upset, they'll cry, they'll scream, they'll kick something, they'll be fine. Right. 5 minutes later, they're great.
Or an animal in nature too, right? Like an animal in nature shakes after it's been chased, and then it's gone.
Right.
Right.
And so I just started learning how to become human again, and how to be more animal than civilized, how to be less this fat domesticated dog that I'd been, and just letting my body be wild and free. I've come to call it the wild cure. I think we all have that instinct in us to be healthy, strong, thriving, on task. But we've become overly comfortable, overly domesticated. Mm-hmm. And if we learn how to be a human animal again, we will become healthy. And even if we don't know how, if we put ourselves in our natural habitat, me getting my butt in that river for 22 days, I got really connected to the river, and it healed a lot of my trauma, but then also healed my immune system and my leukemia. Then the forest started pulling. I tell everybody, the trees will pull it out of you. You ever watch the National Geographic series Alone?
Yeah. You know what I love about that show? I've seen every season.
Yeah, me too.
Is that it's an incredible show, but after like 50, 60 days, I think the coolest part for those that stay that long, give or take, is that they have a direct experience of having to like really know themselves deeply and face their emotions. And that's oftentimes what makes people leave, for better or for worse, is they're like, either I can't take this and they want to leave, or they're like, you know what? I don't even care about the money anymore. I can clearly last out here as long as I want to, but I feel complete, and I've really learned more about myself in this process and had to face myself deeply and be by myself.
Knowing what I know, I feel a little sorry for them. I think they all could enjoy, or at least withstand, the process so much better if the producers would say, okay, now the trees are going to pull it out of you. It's what nature was designed to do. So whatever shit you got in you, if there's sadness, if there's trauma, if there's tragedy, if there's hatred or anger or any of those emotional, psychological, spiritual toxins, be ready for those to come to the surface. Don't feel like you're going crazy. All you're doing is detoxing and healing. And then they'd be able to, what bothers them is they don't know what the hell's happening because we haven't been taught that that's nature's way. That is the wild cure. Mm-hmm. And so I feel a little, I love that show. I've watched every season. I probably shouldn't tell you how many times. But it always makes me sad because I think, when will we get it? That our egos have separated us from nature and then robbed us of happiness and health and community and connection with ourselves, with each other, with this beautiful planet that we live on. Just this last post that I did, I didn't expect it to do well, and it's just really starting to do really well, get big numbers. And when you get big numbers, that's when the haters come out.
Oh, yeah.
And I've had so many people say really awful stuff. And it's simply because they don't understand and haven't been given a chance to understand what I know. And that is, our egos have separated us from nature. They're all saying, oh, yeah, well, why don't you tell the people that are cutting down all the trees to stop? And I tell them, well, yeah, I'd like to, but that's not going to work. What works is you get everybody out there, and like me, they'll fall in love. And then like Jacques Cousteau said, you protect what you love. It's a much more organic form of environmentalism. And it's a much more, I think, powerful and long-lasting one.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially with the context of what you directly experienced, healing, especially as we're in a society that is increasingly sick.
Right.
So when you have examples of someone like you who you could say, quote, defied the odds, I wouldn't even call it that. And I bet you'd agree. It's like, no, I just did what human beings are supposed to do in order to heal.
And mostly accidentally.
Right.
The river, I had no idea it would heal me. And that gave me the courage to try forest bathing. I was hoping that would at least help enough to go ahead and not have to do chemo and radiation. I started that May of 2015. By March of 2016, my lymphoma was gone.
Wow.
I've been able to heal and thrive because I'm feeling really good. And I'm 64 years old. I feel better than I did when I was in my 30s and 40s.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That gives me hope because I'm 31. More. I'm 31, so I hope I'm feeling great like you are when you're.
Well, you'll be better looking at least.
Oh man. Well, I want to share one thing just as a brief aside because I looked this up just beforehand.
Sure.
As it relates to lymphoma.
Right.
And it sounds like from your story, I mean, you tell me if this resonates. Lymphoma, according to German New Medicine, is a self-esteem conflict, not being able to remove or purify something in the effective drainage area. So it's related to self-esteem. And you think like with you having identified as Mary's husband and all these people telling you that, and then you go to Oregon and then you're facing yourself for the first time, you're in the healing phase of this. So does that resonate at all?
That, and I was born in 1960. My dad was just a stud mountain climber. He ran most of the world's major marathons, ran the Boston, ran New York, ran the London, and did well at all of them. As a matter of fact, his time, and he's probably going to kick me for not knowing the exact time, but he ran the Boston in like 3:07.
Wow.
So, I mean, he was a stud.
Yeah.
Harder to follow was he was extremely successful as a corporate executive and made a ton of money. And all of a sudden at 54, after I worked 2 jobs from the time I was 15 to the time I was 42, I did what I considered pay my dues and knuckle down and do everything right. And then at 54, I'm broke and renting and sick.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the self-esteem comes in.
Yeah.
Like so many of us in America, as American males, we're taught that we're only as good as our bank account.
Right.
And my bank account sucked.
Mm-hmm.
And, I heard the stories, well, whatever you lost, you can make. And I knew that, but to have lost so much and then lost what I believed was the opportunity to make a lot of money too. That was a hard hit. And then also, I think having my in-laws go after me, not all of them, some of them were wonderful, but the ones that weren't were really hideous, to this family that I had been a major part of since I was 19.
Yeah.
It felt like such a betrayal.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of those things. So I see how that makes sense.
Yeah, and that may or may not resonate. It was just interesting.
No,
I found that.
It's an insight I hadn't considered before. So I'll probably come up with some great answers in about an hour.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, sorry to pop that one on. You probably should have asked you beforehand.
Pop away.
But the other thing that I wanted to bring up real quick too, just related to chemotherapy and radiation. So chemotherapy, as you know, is a repurposed World War II chemical weapon, which is really interesting. And then some statistics on cancer. So the 5-year survival rate for patients has increased from 63% in 2002, 68% in the conventional allopathic sense in 2015. So it's increased by 5% from 2000 till now. But the other thing that's pretty alarming is in that time, as we know, billions and billions and billions have been poured into cancer research.
Right.
But the cancer cases have risen from 1.3 million to 1.8 and are growing consistently and have increased by 36.5%. So the cancer rates have gone up pretty substantially.
Yeah.
Cancer survival rates have only changed a tiny, tiny bit in that same time frame, yet we've poured billions and billions and billions towards research in the allopathic sense. And you're a walking, living, breathing example of someone who's been diagnosed twice, never received chemotherapy or radiation, and are thriving at age 64.
And fortunate enough to have seen ways that engender confidence for non-relapse.
Right.
When you go in, and please don't hear me, if you're listening and you've done chemo, please don't hear me saying I'm better than you. I would have done it myself. I was just very fortunate. And I'm not particularly against anything. I'm for the things I've seen work for me.
Right.
But almost every cancer patient is scared to death it's going to come back like it did for me. I don't want to sound egotistical or anything, but I don't live scared about that because I feel like I know what happened and why. And I'm going to continue to do those things until I just can't. And I hope that day never comes. For those that went the traditional allopathic route, it's really easy to ascribe the recovery either to the brilliance of their doctor, and there are a lot of brilliant doctors out there, or the poison that they took, the drug that they took, or whatever they took. Both of those are external. Mine, nature's external, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels very internal. And so for me, the locus of control is internal and theirs is external. So my ability to continue my recovery or even leave the cancer behind and walk away from it is pretty easy and powerful, whereas they're stuck to worrying, well, now that I'm not talking to the doctor, now that I'm not taking that medication, what's going to happen?
Right.
Yeah. Big difference. Yeah.
Well, and no one can deny your personal experience in that, right? Like that.
They try to all the time.
Right.
I get, ever since I started having bigger posts on Instagram, I didn't know. Here, I call myself a poor little old ex-cancer patient Who'd pick on a 64-year-old guy who recovered from cancer?
Right.
And I'm not telling
especially a guy smiling in every video that's super nice. Like,
and you'll notice I never am against chemo. I just said I didn't have to have it as kind of gratitude. And I'm not telling anybody they have to do anything. I'm just sharing my story. Man, I've been shocked at how much hate I get, but it lets me know now that I'm getting used to it. If I start getting a lot of hate, I'm like, oh, the post must be doing really well.
And whether those people realize it or not, that's medicine for them, because it's what happens. And I can't say this exclusively, but I would imagine is someone who comes across your page, they see someone or they see you who reversed all of that completely naturally without any of the traditional allopathic approaches, right? And they themselves are someone who experienced cancer and maybe like multiple times experienced cancer and did go the conventional way and are sick and struggling, or really are attached to the idea that that's what helped them, which is like, that may be the case, right? Or they know someone who died, or someone close to them who is perpetually sick with cancer. And what they see is someone who's presenting quite a bit of cognitive dissonance that really throws their whole mindset and their attachment to that story for a loop, because you show that there is a completely different way. But again, that's medicine for them to realize that, again, cognitive dissonance, as tough as that is, it's like, wow, there is another approach to this. And the thing that I've realized along this holistic health journey over the last 8 years now is I've come across countless people, not that have swam, that hold a record for swimming across a river and were the original Wim Hof, but countless people who have had similar stories with healing a number of things, including my own wife, who is told you will always have lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, and that's completely gone. Who have healed a number of things naturally that they were told they would never be able to heal.
Sure. Yeah. And it's happening more and more. My hope and even my prayer is that people start to trust these anecdotes and see them not as outliers, but our inheritance, not only mentally and spiritually, but also physically as we connect with nature more and more and more. But yeah, people come out swinging all the time, and mostly it's because either they're scared and they have cancer and they're betting all of their life literally on this doctor. Whereas I bet my life on other things. Mostly because I had several physicians in my practice as clients, and I heard how they treated their wives and family and some of the decisions they made and what they were thinking. And I thought, ooh, it really took the white coat syndrome off the whole profession. And I realized, these guys aren't even smarter than me in many ways. And I certainly, some of them anyway, just lacked in character. And so it really shattered that doctors are gods of the universe. Yeah, they're just guys, and most of them good-hearted men that are trying their best.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, so it's been interesting to see people's reaction. The wonderful thing is I've had now in the hundreds contact me and say, Dean, you inspired me to do cold water immersion or get out in the forest, and my numbers are drastically turning around. I just had a lady contact me, and I want to verify. I want to make sure, because she had 0 posts and only 5 followers and no picture. So I want to meet her on Zoom, make sure I'm not being set up. But I've had so many others give me like stories, but she even sent me her charts and her numbers. So it's really incredible. She had stage 4 breast cancer.
Wow.
And she and her husband, and it had metastasized, went into several bones. She had several tumors, and she found me on Instagram. And so she and her husband started doing ice baths. And just in the couple months, her numbers took a huge turn, and they were even able to detect brown fat in her bloodstream and all sorts of things happening.
Wow.
And so they are now very hopeful. But I've had one client that I worked with, and I talked to him for 3 years, and he wouldn't do anything. Finally, he was on disability for Crohn's disease and often rheumatoid arthritis, terrible crippling rheumatoid arthritis accompanies that. He was only 43 and having to use a cane. He'd loved backpacking, couldn't even walk a simple trail. And he started this, and within 6 weeks, his rheumatoid arthritis was all but gone. He wasn't using a cane, of doing daily ice baths. And within 6 months, his Crohn's had abated so much, he wondered if it was even ethical to continue to be on disability.
Wow.
And that's becoming more and more routine. Also, as a therapist, most of my domain is mental and emotional and psychological. It's the only thing, and I can say this with a straight face and a whole heart, it's the only thing I've ever found for anxiety that works 100% of the time with 100% of the people.
Wow.
The only times I've seen it, I've had some people DM me, well, it didn't work for me. Well, what temperature were you in? Oh, I was in 60 degrees. Well, that's not ice.
Right.
That's not an ice bath.
Right.
That's not enough to give you a shock.
How many of these people are bathing in, like, are doing not ice baths, but are out in nature in cold too?
That's the thing that shocked me. Biohacking has become such a thing.
Right.
And I think it's wonderful, but it's all there for free if you just know how to tap into it in nature. You're making an artificial thing that's natural out there, and you're almost robbing it of the beauty of any kind of spiritual vibration as well. But I recently went to speak at a cold plunge seminar training and met some folks that are rapidly becoming friends for life. These are wonderful people. But out of the 23, they called it plunging in the wild. Only 2 or 3 had plunged in the wild. Everybody had done it in their bathtub or a cold plunge tank. And I was like some kind of unicorn. I'm like, no, what? And the other thing that's odd to me is they all have this protocol now where they hold their hands out and they wear a beanie. It's water. Just get in.
Yeah. I love that. You're old school. I love that so much. I mean, you're so right though. And I understand for people who are in the city that may not have access to like a super cold river, it makes sense in that context. But there is a point to be said about, I kind of look at the whole, this is going to be a very black and white statement, but just for the sake of the point that I'm trying to make, the whole biohacking space is trying to, just like you said, take something that is naturally occurring and like market it as some hack for your body, when it's just your ability to reconnect with nature in all ways in your life as best as you can, given your circumstances, is what is going to generate healing. And the other thing that I think is so incredible about your story, obviously yours is specific to cancer, but as you mentioned, someone that is one of your clients had Crohn's and rheumatoid arthritis. And that's the whole point here, is that, especially with respect to the emotional piece of it, just being out in nature, the trees, the forest will pull that out of you. And as I've come to understand, which I'm sure you've already mentioned that you agree, that the overwhelming majority of physical disease symptoms have at least some emotional underpinning to them.
I've never, I'm no physician, but I have been a therapist for 34 years. And last November, it's kind of, I don't know if it's the old athlete in me, but I had to have 2,000 hours to sit for my licensure test. Once they got me counting, I'm like, okay, let's keep the score. And in November, I passed 57,000 face-to-face hours.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and the average therapist burns out right around 10 to 15, which is sad because they've finally hit, as Malcolm Gladwell says, that tipping point of mastery.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of hours sitting and listening to folks. And you learn a few things, even if you're not trying to. And it's just, I have never seen a person who is holding on to trauma or tragedy or a heavy emotion without a resultant or accompanying illness. And at the same time, I've rarely seen a person have a breakthrough and it not affect their physiological body. It's mind, body, spirit. You know, Descartes be damned. That we think, therefore I am, that split. And this egocentric idea that we are separate from this beautiful planet that has so many gifts to give us. It's just nuts. And I hope it dries up and goes away. And I really adore many biohackers. Follow them on Instagram, listen to what they say, learn from them. I've got a Morosco. I am fortunate enough to have been sponsored by Morosco Forge. They sent me one of their first. It's one of the best lifestyle hacks I've ever found, to have that waiting for me right there in the garage. I want a sauna like yours. I'm doing all the biohacks. I'm not against them, but let's go the next level. Rather than hacking, let's be having. We should be biohavers. That just came out.
That's good. Biohavers. Have communion with nature.
Just remember, that's mine, not yours.
I got you. What was the other one? Is the prayer pictures that we said?
Praying in pictures.
Praying in pictures. I love that so much. And it's, you know, I look at much of the holistic health space right now, and you know, it's ironic to be saying this while we're in a studio with lights and things like this, but just
it's trying to make us look pretty.
Right, exactly. But it's our ability to reconnect with the natural world in all ways. And again, we live in modern times, especially for those of us in Western cultures, and we are immersed in non-natural things, non-harmonious fields, if you will, But the more that we can be aware of that and use it to our advantage to communicate things like we are, like Instagram is an incredible tool, and this will go on YouTube. This is going to go on Apple and Spotify and all these places where people are going to benefit from hearing it. But it's having the understanding that in your life, as best as you can, to reconnect with the natural world will generate healing. And you are a direct walking, living, breathing example of that.
Yeah. And like I said, if I can, anybody can. Now, I am fortunate to live in what I consider heaven, but many people around the world say, Dean, lucky for you, but I can't do that. Well, there are urban parks. There are botanical flower gardens. There are greenhouses. There's dirt. Take off your shoes and just stick your feet in the dirt. I had one guy that said, Dean, you know, that's all fine and good. I'm the least outdoorsy person you're ever going to meet. He was just this real left-brained accountant type that worked for the government in Oregon. I adore him. Brilliant. Terrible, terrible anxiety, and had suffered from insomnia from the time he was 14 on, mostly because of a tragedy and a trauma. But to just help him to start to de-stress, I said, well, you're working remotely, aren't you? And he said, yeah. And I said, don't you have a real nice backyard that you call your garden? And he said, yeah, because it's kind of a rose garden. He and his wife have built this really beautiful area. I said, tell you what, have you heard or read about grounding or earthing? He said, no. And I said, why don't you read about it? And if it's not too crazy, what I'd like you to do is run an experiment. Just go out every couple hours, take off your shoes and socks, stick your feet in the grass or the dirt, even if it's raining, because it rains 160 to 175 days a year in Portland, Oregon. And if it's raining, just, let yourself get wet or hold an umbrella over, get those feet in the ground. He said, yeah, let me read about it. That's intriguing. So he read about it. He thought the research was good enough. He started, and within 3 weeks, he had his first full night's sleep. He was 45 or 6 since he was 14. And his stress within 6 or 7 weeks went down to a 3. And he thought it had never gone below an 8 since he started this job, which was 20 years earlier. So it's all there, ready and waiting just to give. And, I always thought it was hippy dippy calling the earth Mother Earth. I was fortunate to have a really sweethearted, very giving mother. To me, it's the only sensible thing to call our planet, because she's nurturing like my mama was. She's giving like my mama was. And my mom is really extremely well-read and I think brilliant. The grandkids call her the smartest woman on earth because she reads encyclopedias. So you ask her, how far is it to Ontario? She'll know the exact amount of mileage and stuff. I mean, she holds a lot of trivia. And so our Mother Earth is essentially wise and all-knowing and ready, even when we don't know, to give us the right kinds of things. Yeah.
My buddy Daniel Roytos, who I interviewed for episode 85 of my podcast, made a point to me, and I don't know if he said it after we finished recording or during the recording, but he said, we're electric beings. Electric things need to be grounded.
Yeah.
So that's putting your feet on the earth. Electric things need to be charged. That's sunlight.
Right.
Electric things need to have a really high current, and that is drinking adequate amounts of water, spring water preferably. But it's these simple things, and there's some other things that I typically list too that are totally free or very cheap, like buying spring water if you can't source your own, that so many people, even in the holistic health space, completely overlook.
Yeah.
And turn to supplements and things like this before checking those off consistently. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I tell everybody, you take better care of your cell phone than you do your cellular body. It's not well, I guess it is nuclear science, isn't it? But it's not hard to understand. We are energetic beings and we need to be recharged. And the other thing that was pivotal in my cancer recovery is what I call zeroing out. At the end of every day, I think about everything that's happened. I notice how my body responds to it, and then I let it go. Whatever emotion that produced, I let that emotion go. A lot of people think that we have to resolve something before we let it go. Nah, you can let the emotion go, and that gives you even a more clear head to resolve the problem. But you need to let go. I tell everybody, you need to brush your heart and mind just like you do your teeth before you go to bed every night, because your unconscious never sleeps. And one of the main theories as to why we dream is it's our unconscious trying to resolve the most intense negative emotion we had that day. And whatever we focus on grows. So most people, the reason they're sleepwalking and overwhelmed in life is because they're carrying decades of junk they never let go. I tell, and this may be a bit crass, but I think all of us are emotionally and psychologically constipated.
100%.
Yeah. But naturally, we're not that way. We didn't come into the world that way. And sadly, I've seen loved ones leave the world. We're not going to, most of us, unless it's some kind of traumatic or awful, violent death, we're not going to leave the world that way. We're going to leave with peace and even a feeling of joy. Most of us do. And I believe we come into the world that way, and it's there every moment of every day. It just gets covered up. And if you want to feel real peace and joy, all you have to do is uncover it. It's there. It's there. It's our natural birthright. Yeah.
So well said.
Thank you.
Man, we've been going for like almost 2.5 hours now. So
Sorry.
No, don't apologize.
Yeah,
I'm glad
so
because
fun.
I still have so many questions I think I could ask you. So we'll maybe have to have you back for a part 2 at some point.
Part 2, part 3, any part you want.
Yeah, this was great, Dean. Please let those who are listening and watching know where they can find you and find your book.
Well, I'm really active on Instagram, and I made it a spiritual promise to myself and a discipline that I'm not going to be one of those egotistical guys that think I'm a big shot. even if my Instagram grows. So if you DM me, I DM you back. Unless you're absolutely profane and insulting, I might still DM you back and wish you a good day. But so you can always get a hold of me on Instagram. I would love it if you stopped by my website and saw what I'm up to. It's called thewildcureway.com. I'm really excited about, you can find my book there and on Amazon. My book on Amazon the first month was the #1 swim book on Amazon. I even beat out Michael Phelps' book for a month. Only time I'm ever going to beat him at anything.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and it's called The Wild Cure from Death to Life on Oregon's longest river. But one of the things I'm most excited about now is I'm going to start leading day-long retreats and teaching people what I do and what I know, how to connect with the 4 elements, earth, fire, water, and wind. And I'll do a couple of those as day events at the iconic Cannon Beach in Oregon. And then a wonderful man named Zik Zahaitsky, who was the nation's #3 in endurance athletes only 3 years ago, and is a gifted chef in ancestral foods and primal meats, is going to join me for at least one immersive men's retreat. We're calling it the Wild Cure Warrior. And you see some of these men's retreats where they're wrestling and beating on each other and doing stuff like that. We're going to do some of that, but not the wrestling. I don't believe in violence, and I don't even really believe in competition. I have grown to believe from my swimming that competition is kind of it's necessary for young people, but it kind of is an immature form of connection. I believe everything's about connection. So I'm going to be teaching these men how to connect with themselves, how to connect with each other, and then connect with nature. I call it remember, return, reignite. And that's what we're going to be doing in the Olympic National Forest, one of the most northern rainforests, and it's just a beautiful wild place this July 19th. So if you're interested, get on my website, The Wild Cure Way, and find out about the Wild Cure Warrior Retreat.
Awesome. We'll throw all that in the show notes.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Yeah.
Alec, this has been just, I'd say you made my day, but I think it's going to take me a month or 2 to come down from this one. Thank you.
Same. This was such an incredible conversation, Dean, and such powerful medicine for anyone who watches or listens. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.